Hello, and welcome to Opening Doors podcast. Today, my guest is Jonathan Lewis, who is the Executive Director of Life Abundant Prison Ministries. We're going to learn a lot today from Jonathan. He's going to tell us a little bit about his story, and we're going to learn more about the work that Life Abundant does in the prisons. So, without further ado, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's good to be with you today, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to have you here. So, I know that you don't love talking about all of this. It's sometimes it's hard to bring up the past, but I appreciate your willingness to share your story because of how powerfully it can help others. So, to start from the beginning, tell the audience a little bit about where you started.
Well, thank you for that. And as you mentioned, there's always some difficulty in going through any process of remembering trauma or issues, but I do think there is a healing that can occur at the same time. And so my journey was a relatively common journey in terms of how it began. I was born and raised with two parents in a home, an older sister. I'm originally from the Philadelphia area, so we were there for about 20 years or so. Went to school, had a really good upbringing, a lot of family connections. There were uncles and aunts and neighbors, people who were extended family. We were all together, really having an okay experience. And then at some point, I ended up hanging out with probably what we would now call the wrong crowd. At that time, they didn't seem like they were the wrong guys, but at that time, it was really more of a system in which that required us to, you know, be a little mischievous, and so small infractions turned into larger infractions that then turned into selling drugs, using drugs. Um, that turned into a few arrests and then a few incarcerations for shorter periods of time, primarily county jail in Philadelphia. Over probably a course of about 9.5 years, that just became the norm. It was really an in and out of the system, and I was, I'd say, one of those folks who understood the idea of the revolving door. Um, then in 2000, uh, I was really introduced to some ideals of spirituality. Some folks who were part of the jail community ended up talking to me about what they called a better way. I wasn't necessarily sure it was a better way. I will mention that I did grow up in a religious circle. My mom and dad were both churchgoers and Christians, and most of the extended family were grandparents and aunts and uncles. However, it wasn't a religion that I was willing to subscribe in at that time. And so then when you fast forward to the conversations, I started to kind of remember some of what I had heard when I was much younger. So we took off from there, and then that kind of changed the trajectory of the next few years.
How old were you when this happened? When you were first introduced back to religion in the jail system?
26 years old.
Okay.
hmm
And
hmm
and how far along was this in your 9-year journey?
Pretty, I would say really the end, because you figure I started getting in trouble with the juvenile justice system when I was about 12. So I spent time in the youth study center, all the way up until I was about 17. And then those crimes obviously required that I spend time somewhere else. And so I had to go to adult jail, which was then the Philadelphia Industrial Complex. So at that time, there were four jails there, and I spent time at all those jails from 17 to 26.
Wow. Okay. So then at 26, you were pretty tired of this roller coaster.
Yeah, yeah, it felt like a lifetime. Those few years ended up really being in several different roles, and putting on many different masks and faces and all those things to try to navigate those few years. And at that point, I was just not tired. I was exhausted at that point.
And at 26, I guess you thought, all right, something's got to give.
Yeah, and it was really interesting because some of the guys in the jail, which is not always the case for jailhouse conversions, right? The older gentleman had told me all about his relationship with God, and at the time I was not necessarily again interested. It was a frustration for me because I thought of my parents and all those people I knew who were part of the religious community. They didn't seem to have a lot of stuff. And for me, that was almost the way in which God is supposed to reveal himself to you is that you get stuff. And we didn't have stuff.
You
And
mean like
so,
material stuff.
yes, yes, material stuff. And so I was so frustrated hearing this young man's story that I really rejected him at first, but he was belligerent. And he said, I still think you should listen. And he gave me a Bible, and I took it just out of maybe a mutual respect and just to get him to move along. And then I went into a jail cell that night and used the Bible and prayed a bit, and it just felt like it was the right thing. And from that point forward, it's been that same right thing for me.
Wow. Okay. So I got chills just now. I it's really powerful, that whatever it is that people can find
Hmm.
to make that transition, and for a lot of people, it really is spirituality. It's a,
Hmm.
and um, being able, I guess, to find something bigger than yourself. And so you found some purpose, and how did that all transpire, and what did that lead to for you?
It really began that night. It was okay, if there is a God and he wants me to do something or to be something, I'm assuming he's a good guy in some way. So then I need to be a good guy in some way so that we can continue to have some sort of relationship. And I'm somewhat intellectual, so I really like to be hands on and process information. And so for me, the next right step was then to learn more about what this new thing is. So I went to a Bible study, spent time there, and really gravitated toward trying to understand more of the text. Like, where did it come from? Why do we follow it? All those kinds of things. And that then prompted me to want to go to a religious program upon release. And so I went to a residential aftercare program, leaving behind property and connections to family just so that I could do something totally different. And at that point, I was surrounded by other folks who had similar experiences, practitioners and workers that had known about how to help folks who were returning to their communities or just returning to society in general. And through those relationships, I started to go back to work full time, secure an apartment, and identification and all those things you need to be a productive citizen.
So this was a halfway house, or this was like a religious focused um, place where you were living after release?
Yes, it was a residential aftercare facility, and it was run by people who were part of a faith community. Now,
Okay.
you didn't have to be, a particular type of faith to be in the facility. It did help because sometimes we went to church, but there were folks there that were, not religious, and they still went through the program as well.
So at this point, then you had an apartment, you said, and a
Hmm.
job,
Hmm.
and so what did you do to start giving back? How did that happen?
So I originally thought I would give back just a little. I would maybe teach some Bible studies and classes because now we are 26. I'm probably 28 or 9 at this point, and I had spent a lot of time reading and going to services and those kinds of things. And I felt that one of my gifts or skill sets was to really teach and facilitate Bible discussions or educational sessions. And so I spent a lot of time doing that. So I figured maybe I'd give back that way. One of the staff members at the facility ended up leaving, and so the executive director asked me to take that position. I was a full time contractor at that point, and I was not necessarily considering leaving a job where, I may have made $70,000 a year or something like that to then take a position for $20,000 and, maybe some food and board from time to time. So it wasn't very attractive. However, at the time, the place really was center in my heart. They had helped me at that point, and they needed help, and so gave my boss a 9 month notice. I ended up working for them part time and for my boss full time, and then I eventually left and went full time there. And then I was in that reentry space from about as 29 till now, and I'm almost 50. So I've been doing the same
All right.
job now.
Wow. So you stayed in the reentry space
Mhm.
for a
Yeah.
long
My wife, when I got married, she would always tease and say, "But you still know how to fix things, so I need you to fix these things." And so I
That was
still do
good,
that on the
right?
side.
She got lucky. She's like, all right, I got a guy who can fix stuff. That's important.
Yes,
Somebody's
yes.
relationship needs to be able to fix stuff. Yeah. So, wow. Okay. So was it Life Abundant? Is it Life Abundant that you've been with? No, it was a different.
No, yes, it was a different group in Montgomery County, and I probably worked for those guys for a while. Now, I did have a little bit of time away from just full time employment because I worked there for maybe 7 years, and then I had an opportunity to go back to school for continuing education. And remember early on, I really liked context and learning. And so had an opportunity to go for a 4 year undergraduate degree. So I went out to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois, and I spent 4 years there. And then I returned to Pennsylvania, started back at that same organization with another job, which I wasn't sure I was going to do, but I went back again, stayed another 6.5 years. And then from there, I transitioned to the position as the executive director at Life Abundant.
So tell me a little bit about what Life Abundant does in the jails and what you do now in your
Hmm.
role.
Sure. Well, primarily, Life Abundant is the religious arm. So our primary focus is to provide religious services through Bible studies, one-on-one mentoring. There are random sessions that we hold throughout the year that talk about things like purpose or things like calling, things that we believe ultimately can give people some sense of a greater purpose. And when you can tap into, again, some of that idea, it helps people to change their worldview. And if you can change your worldview, ultimately the individual may choose to do something other than criminal activity. And so we really focus there. We also run some of the release and reintegration courses that are primarily then about the practice of spending time working on yourself while you're in prison. So we really communicate a lot of the decision making classes, uh, communicate the importance of doing job readiness training. So we're kind of the almost like the first arm that really kind of funnels people to the other programs that provide some of those services more specifically. So we partner with those guys and trying to make sure that they have the right people in their classes.
Which counties are you in? Um,
Bucks
just
County primarily. Now
got it.
we do some work in Montgomery County, and this is really before the pandemic. I still talk with the chaplain and the assistant warden over at SCI Phoenix because we were holding some studies and sessions at SCI Greaterford that then closed down and became SCI Phoenix. And since the pandemic, they haven't really had a lot of volunteers or contract services back at the facility as they did before the pandemic. And so we're still in that process of trying to figure out what it would look like going back full time.
So, so it sounds like, and I know this from both of our work with the Bucks County Reentry Coalition, that Bucks
Hmm.
County really is doing a lot to make sure that uh, that people that are incarcerated are getting prepared
Hmm.
for release with training and with job readiness. What are what are some of the other ways that you see the reentry process being improved? Because recidivism is such a huge issue. I mean,
Hmm.
and you know it. It was your issue too.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And we will say that we're roughly 67% recidivism somewhere in the southeastern district. So that would include Bucks County. And you have to round up. There, 7 out of 10 people are going to return to prison within a 3-year period of time. That's the stat. And so we're looking at how do we reduce those numbers, and that's been the aim, like you said, of the Reentry Coalition and those that are part of it. One of the things that Bucks County does very well is to create systems and programs and services that can help the individual. One of the things that we could do a little bit better is coordinating some of those efforts. And I think the coalition is one of the ways in which that can actually happen, because it gives providers a chance to connect with other providers to then come away with a more holistic plan as to how this individual can ultimately engage in a continuum of care. Because that's the key. If you have housing, but you don't have drug and alcohol supports, let's say at that residential facility, then you may need to talk to someone who actually has it so that this individual could get that particular support. Or if you have opportunities for people to secure gainful employment, but then you don't have a place for the person to live so that they can actually have a place to go to get to work, then you would need to obviously connect with those people who have the residential facilities. And I think that's the missing element often, not just in Bucks County, but in any county,
Everywhere.
that
Right. Yeah.
none of us have a silver bullet, right? There's no silver bullet for reentry. We all have to find ways to cross over those lines to make sure that we're creating a seamless approach. We call it a warm handoff. The person
Right.
goes from here to here to here. They're collecting all of those services. And then at the end of the process, they actually have all of the supportive services that they need.
Right. Because not there's so many different organizations, like you're saying, that give a little piece. So you've got the housing piece, the work piece, maybe there's even transportation piece,
Mhm.
drug and alcohol, but all of those organizations need to be able to communicate with each other and have that ability for that warm handoff.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, right. And so right. So it is, and it's a lot. There's a lot. There are a lot of aspects that go into coming out of incarceration and back into general population,
Hmm.
including just getting ID. It's a really overwhelming process.
Yes.
I have not had to do it. I was fortunate to go through a simulation
Hmm.
and realize that the roadblocks are um, huge, and that in some ways it makes it easier to understand why there's 7 out of 10 people are going back to jail, because um, we need to do more
Hmm.
for people when they're released.
Yes. Yes.
Um, so, if I can ask you a piece of advice to family members and of people that are incarcerated and incarcerated folks, how and advice that you might give on how they can communicate a little more safely with each other. What is a piece of advice you could give to help family members and their incarcerated family members communicate more safely?
Sure. That's a big question, because the person who's incarcerated I mean, there's so many different reasons why the person could be there, right? Often when you think of jail or prison, the general public has an idea of this is the guy that's behind bars, or this is the woman that's behind bars, and it's really kind of a straw man thought where it's just as diverse as the general public, right? So you have all types of criminal offenses, all types of people, all types of backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities. So family members are coming from various vantage points. The one thing that I think can be common throughout all those processes is understanding a bit about the system itself, because you have to know what the person is dealing with at the facility that they're at. That's number one. So we get a lot of calls from family members, and they'll say, can I take my son a sandwich today? I say, well, you can't take a sandwich to the jail. That's not something you can do, right? Understanding that this person is actually under the custody of the Department of Corrections is something that you first have to, what does that even mean? So you have to begin there by understanding what incarceration is. And then getting specific into the facility is the person at, let's say, Bucks County. Bucks County rules are going to be different than Montgomery County rules, maybe. And Montgomery County and Bucks County's rules are going to be different than SCI Phoenix, because that's a state correctional institution. So recognizing where your loved one is and understanding what they're dealing with is probably one of the best first steps, because then you get to understand how you will be able to engage in the process with them. Can you write them letters? Can you visit them? Do you have an opportunity to connect them to resources if you learn what resources are actually at the facility? That's probably the one thing that cuts across all of the criminal offenses that a person would be dealing with while they're in prison. Understand the system a little bit better.
And so, how can family members learn to understand the system? Is there, I mean, I guess talking to someone like you is, an organization like Life Abundant. Is there another organization or a place where they can learn?
Well, when you mentioned the Bucks County Reentry Coalition, that's a great place to start, right? The Bucks County Reentry Coalition has a website, and on the website, which people in prison couldn't access, but family members could, they can go there and learn more about the programs that are inside the institution to be able to tell the individual on the inside that might not have access to that same information to know you could sign up this week and go and work on your GED. You could sign up for the job readiness program. Did you know it's there? And then they would say, I didn't. Well, make sure you sign up with your case manager so that you can participate in that program.
Let's just pause for a moment and
Yes.
address the fact that the person on the inside doesn't have access to knowledge about what they can do to help themselves while they're on the inside. They have to get that information from their family members or friends from the outside. That to me is a huge failing right there.
Well, sometimes what happens, and it's not all the time, but often when jails have more people, so when their population swells, they only have so many staff persons that can get to so many inmates at a time. So you may have a case manager and you may have 60 inmates. How often can he get to each one of those inmates? Right.
Okay.
So it's going to take 30 days maybe before he can get to all those guys. And so they may not know about all the programs. And if a new program gets approved and you just had a visit with the case manager,
Oh my
it
gosh,
might be another 30 days before you find out about the new program. See, so sometimes it's just
okay.
timing and supply and demand. There are just so many people and so few staff that they might not get the information in real time.
Okay, so the real takeaway here is family members, make sure you are advocating and learning on behalf of your incarcerated son, daughter, wife, husband.
Yes.
Make sure that you are out there learning what you can learn, because you may have more access to information than the person that is in the prison system. So it
Yes.
is a collaboration then. So family members have an important role there.
Yes. Yes. A huge role. In fact, they are going to be the greatest advocate.
All right. Thank you. That was good. I really thank you. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
I learned a lot just now from you. Thank you, Jonathan.
Sure, sure.
And then, all right, here's another big one. Just a real quick, not real quick, but what is something that you think could be done within the justice system as it is now to prevent the mass incarceration that we see? What is something that could be changed, do you think, to prevent?
I would say probably, and I could really speak to Pennsylvania probably more than other places, just because we
Right.
have certain legislation that I'm a little more familiar with. And I would say um, either shortening probation and or not following up with mandatory incarceration for probation violations. Like that's probably one of the biggest things. Pennsylvania actually has, I want to say they're number one or number two for the average length of incarceration and probation for the country. So that's huge. We spend a lot of time giving someone, for example, they may get an 11 to 23-month sentence and they complete 11 months and they may get released. And then they have 5 years of probation to do for one
Well,
charge. That's a lot of time. If you count it all up from day one to the end of that 5 year probation, that would have been almost 6 years for a crime. And if you were to violate somewhere in that 5 year window, let's say in year four, you could go back in front of a judge and he could say, I need to restart your probation.
whoa, whoa.
And then
Okay,
he could
so
say, you have to do this time from now because you're in a direct violation. Now, oftentimes they will just reinstate and start from a point to another point, but it's within his jurisdiction to extend it, and it does sometimes get extended. So now you're starting again at year four with 5 more years probation. Now, let's say you make it to the end. That's 5 plus 4 plus the year that you did inside. That's a really long time for one crime. Now, some people would argue, well, they violated, so they should have to go and meet the consequences. And I think there should be. I'm not necessarily one who doesn't believe that we should have some punitive process here, but I do think sometimes it's a bit heavy-handed because it can extend for so long because you can violate for something as simple as not having a job because you didn't pay your court costs and probation fees on time, and that's a violation.
right, yeah. So that kind of stuff to me seems incredibly heavy-handed and not conducive to keeping people out.
Yes.
There's are there people trying to change that in Pennsylvania?
Yes. And I will say, and this is not just because I work in Bucks County, because I actually live in Montgomery County. So it would be more conducive for me to say they're doing a great job in Montgomery County. But in Bucks County, one of the things that they have come up with is all these different types of courts. They are one of the first in the country to really push the envelope for things like drug court and behavioral health court. Um, they actually don't send people to prison typically for their first violation on probation, which is different from most of the other counties, especially in southeastern Pennsylvania. So they're a little bit ahead, and I think they are in a position to really create a type of process that could be replicated in other counties that would ultimately show that you are still reducing recidivism while at the same time you're not being heavy handed with things like extended probation. That could be a model that could be followed across the country.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm,
That's very good information. I
mhm,
appreciate your sharing that with listeners and
mhm.
with me. And thank you again for all the work that you do helping people in the prison system and for coming and speaking and sharing your story and your wealth of knowledge on Opening Doors podcast.
Not a problem. Not a problem. It's always a pleasure. And thank you so much again, Rachel, even just for the invitation.
All right. Take care, John. A thin.
Bye bye.